From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Welcome to today's program titled When Washington Bailed Out Mom and Pop, featuring Marc Levinson. I am Gulnar Nagashabayeva, Business Reference Specialist at the Science, Technology, and Business Division. It is my great pleasure to introduce Marc Levinson, an economist and historian whose professional life has centered on disentangling complex economic issues. Since 2010, he has been research manager for transportation and industry analysis at the Congressional Research Service here in the Library of Congress. He joined CRS from the Council on Foreign Relations, where he was senior fellow for international business. He spent a decade as an economist at J.P. Morgan Chase, and before that had a long career in journalism, serving as finance and economics editor of the Economist, and as a writer on business and economics at Newsweek. In addition to writing for many leading publications, Marc is author of 5 books. The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, was praised as one of the best business books of 2006 for showing how a seemingly simple invention helped reshape the world economy by driving down the cost of freight. His latest book, The Great A&P and the Struggle for Small Business in America, was published in September 2011. We all have been hearing about bailouts of all sorts quite frequently over the past few years. The federal government's bailout of the U.S. auto industry, the bailout of big banks, the bailout of Wall Street, all those companies too big to fail. Today we will hear a slightly different story. How about the company that became too big and too efficient to allow to succeed? How about the government bailing out neighborhood mom and pop stores? That is the story of A&P, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company that Marc wrote about in his latest book. You will have an opportunity to purchase a copy of this fascinating history of A&P signed by the author at the end of the program. Without further ado, I present to you Marc Levinson.
Thank you very much, Gulnar, and good morning, everyone. Those are not my slides, so you can feel free to disregard. In fact, you can turn the whole thing off. Before we start, a couple of things. One is that the work I'm talking about and the book I've written were written before I came into the federal employ, and have nothing to do with my work here at CRS. So the library and CRS are in no way responsible for anything I may or may not say over the next few minutes. The other is I would like at this point to record my gratitude to the library. Some of the work for the book and some of the photos for the book come from the Library of Congress, which is a terrific resource for this sort of thing. Is Georgia Higley here? I wanted to particularly thank the newspaper division, that newspaper section that Georgia leads. I had to do at one point some research for reasons that you'll learn of in just a moment into the nature of the tea trade in America in the middle of the 19th century. And it turns out that the Library of Congress is the only place that has a full run of the principal business newspaper of that day, the Journal of Commerce. And so I came here and went into the newspaper reading room. This was about 3 years ago. And asked for this, and I thought I was going to get a microfilm. And I waited a few minutes while she went into the back room, and then I was horrified to actually be presented with bound volumes of 150-year-old newspapers that did, in fact, have what I needed to know. So the Library of Congress has some really incredible resources, and I was fortunate enough to be able to make use of them. If you were to ask people to describe the U.S. economy, most folks would probably say to you something like, we have a capitalist market economy. Those concepts, those words, tend to be used interchangeably quite often. And in fact, they really don't have anything to do with each other, or don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. I would think that most Americans are quite happy with the notion that the economy ought to be capitalist, in the sense that they don't want the government owning all the businesses. But people are quite uncomfortable with many aspects of the market. And there's in fact often a conflict between capitalism and what markets do. Markets are dislocating. Markets can cause people to lose their jobs, can cause businesses to close up, can cause towns to experience hardship. And historically, we have a great deal of discomfort with markets, even as we support capitalism. This frequent conflict between capitalism and markets, this dissonance, is really the subject of my book here on the Great Atlantic and Pacific. The A&P began right around the beginning of the Civil War. The company's official story goes something like this. Back in the year 1859, a little store opened its doors on Vesey Street in New York. This was the first store of the great chain of grocery stores now operated by the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. George H. Hartford, the founder, had a vision, the hope of a great national business. That's the myth of the Great A&P. That myth was propagated by the company for perhaps 80 years. Not a word of it is true. The Great Atlantic and Pacific was not founded on Vesey Street. It was not founded by George H. Hartford, and it was almost certainly not founded in 1859. The founder was a man named George F. Gilman. Gilman was a leather merchant. He owned a family business, a warehouse, and leather tannery in a part of New York that was known as the Swamp. For those of you who know New York City, the Swamp was just to the east of New York City Hall. Much of it is now covered by the approach roads to the Brooklyn Bridge. But this was an area that had some small creeks flowing through it, which were perfect for tanneries to use to get rid of their rather noxious waste. So the Swamp had about 6 or 8 blocks of little tanneries, cheek by jowl, little wood frame buildings for the most part, and in the backyard was a yard that was used to tan hides. And that's what Gilman's business was. For some reason, in the late 1850s, we don't know exactly when and we don't know exactly why, he decided to sell tea as well. This isn't as strange as it may seem. Being in the hides business required him frequently to go over to the docks, which were not too far away. The hides were mostly imported, and so he had to go and deal with arriving ships, keep track, get shipping intelligence, bid at auctions, or obtain his merchandise otherwise. The tea business was pretty much the same. All of the cargo was imported on the very same docks, was dealt with in pretty much the same way, so this was not a big shift. The nice thing about tea was, one might say, it was a somewhat more genteel business to be in than smelly old hides. And so he started this business with sometime in the late 1850s, probably. Eventually opened up a shop, not on Vesey Street, but on the opposite side of Manhattan Island on Front Street, where he was one of a couple of hundred merchants, mostly food merchants, selling things out of a warehouse. He sold his hides business to his brother and became a tea merchant. George H. Hartford, the hero of the official A&P story, was actually a young clerk in those days. He worked for Gilman. He was not a partner of Gilman. And Gilman is the genius who built this little tea company. Now, New York in those days had dozens and dozens of tea companies, and there was nothing distinctive about Gilman and Company. So what he did in 1863 was to rename his little company. He called it the Great American Tea Company. At this point, he did move it to Vesey Street, and he started advertising like crazy, so everyone would know that the Great American Tea Company was in business. At a time when advertisements were in small, dense type in the newspapers, he would take quite large ads, and he would herald everything sold at 2 cents per pound profit. Now, your average tea buyer had no idea whether 2 cents per pound profit was big or little, but he was introducing a novel idea. He would actually publish the prices of his teas in the newspaper. No one else did. This was bad news, of course, for the grocery industry and for the tea industry. The way the tea business worked is that a handful of merchants in New York bought the incoming teas. They sold them off in lots to tea dealers in places like Boston and Cincinnati, who sold them off in lots to tea jobbers in smaller towns in those areas, who sold them off to wholesalers who handled individual towns, and eventually the tea, by this point rather stale, got to a store where it might be sold to the public. Gilman's notion was that you could deal directly with him. This is what he promoted. You could deal directly with him. And in 1865, he started advertising the idea that you could order tea from the Great American Tea Company by mail. You could form a buying club, and he took advertisements in publications that circulated nationally, things like the Methodist, as well as the Atlantic. And these gave instructions. People didn't know how to order by mail. This was an entirely new phenomenon. So you would get a bunch of your friends together, you would write down the orders, and the person who organized the order would get a pound of tea free. This was his way of becoming big, and part of his marketing problem was that people were unaccustomed to sending money by mail. So he had to persuade people that this little company he had was in fact great. Gilman was a promoter. Gilman was a huckster. He learned the huckster business from P.T. Barnum. P.T. Barnum, for those of you who may not be familiar, was really the first great marketer in American history. Among the things he built were something called the American Museum, which was located right around the corner from Gilman's old shop in the Swamp in New York City. The American Museum had all sorts of freaks and purported freaks, and people would pay a lot of money to go into this building and see the things that P.T. Barnum had put on display. So it was a privately owned and very profitable museum. P.T. Barnum was a master at promotion, and Gilman adopted many of his ideas. So the Great American Tea Company, which by the mid-1860s had 5 locations in New York, set up a coffee roaster on Broadway at Bleecker Street. That was the Times Square of the day. That was the center of New York's entertainment industry. So anybody who was walking by could watch the roaster and smell the coffee. He advertised that they were getting their teas straight off the ship from China, that they were importers. Well, so far as I could tell, the Great American Tea Company never imported a thing. But he would sell it. They decorated their stores. All this tea was supposed to come from China. And so the Great American Tea Company's stores started to be decked out in Chinese-style decorations. He would outfit a team of horses, white horses with black lines and saddles and bridles, and they would go around New York City or anywhere else he eventually decided to open a store, pulling a wagon which was carrying a chest of tea. And he would have a contest. Guess how much the wagon and the horses and the tea weigh. And whoever won would get a gold bond, a government bond. So he was really a very aggressive promoter at a time when promotion was at its infancy. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. The Golden Spike was driven in Utah. And so Gilman had the idea of creating a new enterprise, and it was called the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Now, the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company wasn't a company. In fact, it operated out of precisely the same premises as the Great American Tea Company. But he didn't want people to know about that. If you ordered by mail from the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, you sent your money to Church Street in New York. If you ordered by mail from the Great American Tea Company, you sent your money to Vesey Street in New York. As it happens, the building was on a corner, and both of these addresses were the exact same building. But Gilman's notion was that you could sell more tea if people thought there was competition. So Great American and Great Atlantic and Pacific competed. During all of this period, George Hartford went from clerk to being the cashier to eventually being the treasurer of what was a growing business, but still a pretty small business. In 1870, Gilman introduced the first of what would be an array of new products at A&P, something called Thea nectar, Thea being Latin for what was then the genus of the tea plant. What was novel about Thea nectar is that it came in a box. It was a branded product. And there were very few branded products in those days, and no such thing as a branded tea. So this was a unique product. After all, much as Gilman and Great American and A&P might try to promote their teas as special, they were the same teas everybody else had. You'd go into the store and the clerk would scoop you out a pound. Thea nectar was a unique product. It came in a cardboard box, which was expensive in those days. It had a picture on it of a little tea goddess, and was really one of the first consumer food products to be sold in the United States. A few years later, the tea business wasn't in great shape, and so the company added sugar, and now the Great American and Great Atlantic and Pacific stores basically had three products: sugar, some coffee, and tea. And that was kind of the extent of it. George Hartford finally was asked to become a partner in this business in 1878. By that point, the Great Atlantic and Pacific was the main name, and there were stores in a number of cities around the country, typically one or two stores in a city. And Gilman wanted to get out of the business. He wanted to retire, he said. And so George Hartford took control of the business and started introducing new products. Baking powder, a very controversial product in the 1880s for reasons I won't go into. Spices, other sorts of things that were new. Not yet a grocery. And there's a reason for that. It was really not possible to operate what we would think of as a modern grocery store in this period because there really weren't any branded products. Cans, boxes, things that you could put labels on and brand names on were very expensive. So your typical store simply had bulk products, and as a shopper you couldn't tell if they were different from the bulk products down the street. There was no way to operate a grocery business. But fast forward a few years, in the 1880s there were some important technological advances in making boxes, printing boxes, making cans. The food processing industry grew like crazy. By the end of the century, it accounted for a fifth of all U.S. manufacturing. And once you had cheap canning and cheap boxes, then you had packages on which you could put a brand name. Then you could ship branded products to retailers, and they could sell something that might not be on sale at the store down the street. As a consumer, you could go into the store and you could ask for a product. Wouldn't just say molasses. You could ask for a product by name, by brand, and try and get some particular good. So this was the beginning of the grocery industry. A&P started adding these kinds of products, some of them with its brand name, and other companies started operating chain groceries as well. At this point in time, they were pretty small, but these companies did have their own warehouses in some cases. They did use their own brands in some cases. They tried to promote themselves as larger entities, and they tried to bargain with the manufacturers. Not very successfully around 1900, but that would come. In 1903, the Hartfords, George Hartford, finally gained control of the business. George Gilman died, and after a lot of litigation, George Hartford took over the Great Atlantic and Pacific. But at this point, he was 69. He was ready to slow down a bit, and the business was given over to his two sons, George L. Hartford and John A. Hartford. These two men would run this company into the 1950s. Together, they worked at the Great Atlantic and Pacific for 140 years. It was their entire career. And they were quite different individuals. George was as introverted as they come. He was a man who, at this period of time when cars were new, he liked to work on cars when he got home from work. He liked to do jigsaw puzzles. He liked to do things that didn't require him to talk to people. Okay? He was really uncomfortable being out and around people. He was the inside guy. Oh, and by the way, he was a financial genius. His education had ended in 9th or 10th grade. He certainly had no college, but he was really good with numbers, and he became the company's numbers man, the president, the treasurer, and then the president, and is the one who kept the company on a sound footing for many years. His brother, a younger brother, John A. Hartford, was the exact opposite personality-wise. He was outgoing. He loved to meet people. He'd meet store managers, he'd meet suppliers, he'd meet customers, he'd shake any hand he could get close to. He had the virtue of being out and around, which George certainly was not. And being out and around, he picked up on some of the important trends going on in American society in the early 20th century. One of those trends was scientific management. There was a lot of concern that businesses were not really very well run, and that pertained particularly to the food business. People said, you know, there's a lot of waste here. This is really inefficient. We're starting to see management come into industry. These are the days of Frederick Winslow Taylor, for those of you who are familiar with him and the ideas of scientific management, where they would look at individual tasks in a factory and say, how can this job be done more efficiently? There wasn't anything like that in the food industry. And it actually became a political issue. In the 1912 election, there was a lot of complaint about the rising cost of food, the inefficiency of the food distribution system. The academic organizations did studies and put out special issues of their journals on making the food industry more efficient. And John Hartford had an idea. In 1912, the company opened a grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is where its headquarters were. It already had some grocery stores in Jersey City, but this one was different. It was smaller than the other ones. It did no advertising. It had a very limited stock of merchandise. It had one employee. The manager was the only employee. He locked the door behind him when he went to lunch. It had no telephone, so people couldn't bother the manager with phone calls. Oh, and it had very low prices. Because the costs were so low, they could set the prices in the store much lower than at the normal A&P stores. And without advertising, this store became a roaring success. What they discovered is, first off, that this small store would sell less merchandise than a normal store. Okay, for most people in the grocery business, that sounded like bad news. But this small store would make more profit than the normal grocery store because even though it sold less, it required much less investment. There were fewer goods sitting around the store unsold. There were fewer employees. And so the way to reduce costs was to think scientifically about how to run this store to maximize profit. And that's exactly what the Great Atlantic and Pacific did. This store was a great success. In 1912, before the economy store opened, A&P operated roughly 400 stores around much of the country, from Atlanta to Kansas City to Boston. By 1920, A&P had 4,588 stores. It just opened these economy stores like crazy, driving down the cost of groceries, and immediately became by far the largest retailer in the business. In fact, in 1920, after World War I, the Great Atlantic and Pacific, this little tea company that had become a little grocery chain, was the largest retailer in the world. From the early part of the 20th century, chain retailers, and particularly A&P, started to sense some trouble. After all, there were independent merchants, and they didn't necessarily like the chains. There were wholesalers who serviced those independent merchants, and they sure didn't like the chains. And there started to be some assaults on chain stores. A name associated with this that may be familiar to you is Louis Brandeis, later to be a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Brandeis propagated the idea that discount merchandising, low-priced merchandising, actually didn't save the consumer any money. It deprived the consumer of choice and confused the consumer. So Brandeis argued that it was the government's proper role to limit this sort of discounting. This came to a head very quickly. In 1914, A&P had a run-in with a company that no longer exists, but whose name you'll remember. It was called the Cream of Wheat Company. Okay. The Cream of Wheat Company, of course, has long since merged, but its product you know. The Cream of Wheat Company sold through wholesalers to merchants all over the country. And A&P said, we don't want to buy from a wholesaler. We want to buy from you directly. No reason to pay a wholesaler's commission, right? Cream of Wheat Company said, okay, but you've got to promise us that you'll charge at least 14 cents per box of cream of wheat at retail, because we don't want you to underprice the other retailers who are selling our product. Well, A&P bought the cream of wheat and then put it on sale for 12 cents. The Cream of Wheat Company stopped delivering cream of wheat, and A&P sued under the antitrust laws, charging that the Cream of Wheat Company was actually a monopoly here, trying to keep up the price of cream of wheat. This went to court. It went to court with what by today's standards was amazing speed. It got tried and adjudicated within a year, and the judge ruled strongly in favor of the Cream of Wheat Company. He said that A&P was the monopoly because it was lowering prices, and by lowering prices it would drive out the 14-cent grocers. Once it drove out the 14-cent grocers, it would have a monopoly and it could charge any price it wanted for cream of wheat. So discounting, in the court's opinion, was a bad idea, an idea that was very harmful to the consumer. This was a notion that became pretty much ingrained in the U.S. political dialogue over the next few years. In the 1920s, the Hartfords started integrating vertically. They already had several thousand stores. They bought bakeries. They bought salmon canning plants. They bought milk canning plants. Fresh milk was hard to ship and store in those days for obvious reasons, so a lot of people bought condensed milk, evaporated milk. They bought plants to sell this, to make this. They had plants that canned fruit and vegetables. They had, in pretty short order, more than 70 manufacturing plants. It took them a while to learn how to use these plants, but they figured out that they could organize the orders from their stores to make these manufacturing plants very profitable. A typical problem with food processing is that the plants run at capacity for part of the year and stand empty for part of the year. And A&P figured out that it could coordinate the orders from its stores to keep its plants running full blast year-round, thereby reducing its costs and making the plants highly profitable. Similarly, it was able to produce bread more cheaply than any other baker in the country. It became the second largest baker and provided almost all the bread for its own stores. This idea of vertical integration met with great suspicion. It was unfair because A&P it was thought, could make a profit on its manufacturing process and not on its stores. So it was therefore able to render unfair competition to mom and pop stores. Worse, A&P figured out how to use its manufacturing capacity as leverage. It would go to a manufacturer and say, we're paying you 3.5 cents per can for green beans. We think it's possible to can these green beans for 3.2 cents. If you would like to sell us green beans at 3.2 cents, we'll buy them from you, otherwise we'll can them ourselves. So now it was pushing down supplier prices, using its manufacturing capacity as leverage to get a better deal from suppliers. These suppliers all had to sell directly to A&P. It would not deal with wholesalers. The suppliers had to rebate to A&P the commission that they otherwise would have paid to wholesalers, which could be 10% or more. The suppliers were asked to provide A&P with advertising allowances, in return for which A&P could turn a brand into a hit. A&P, after all, had national reach. It had stores from coast to coast, but it would negotiate with these suppliers that it would get a rebate of so many cents per case or per 1,000 cases or whatever to advertise their goods. So A&P was avoiding wholesale costs, it was getting advertising rebates, and it was getting enormous volume discounts because it was buying by the freight car load, not by the case like the mom and pop grocers. It was underpricing mom and pop grocers, according to numerous studies in the day, by 10 to 15%. Well, mom and pop didn't like this for reasons you might understand. And in the mid-1920s, the fight became serious. The city of Danville, Kentucky, passed a tax on all grocery stores. But the tax was different for what it called regular service grocers and for cash and carry grocers. Regular service grocers, that was mom and pop. Okay, they provided full service to everybody who walked in the door, and they gave credit. Okay. The cash and carry grocers, that meant the chains, and principally A&P, which is by far the largest grocery chain. And they had to pay a tax that was much higher than the tax imposed on the regular service grocers. Well, that particular law was declared unconstitutional in Kentucky, but the idea was here to stay. It was, in fact, validated by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1931. The Supreme Court heard a couple of cases and reached the conclusion that chain retailing was a different business from independent retailing, and so could be taxed differently. The Supreme Court approved a particular kind of tax, a tax that was based not on sales or not on profits, but on the number of stores that a retailer happened to own. This was a tax that again was designed principally to thwart A&P because A&P had more stores than the next 7 chain grocers put together. In 1929, when it became the first grocer to reach sales of $1 billion in a single year, the first retailer of any sort to reach sales of $1 billion in a single year, A&P had 16,000 stores in the United States. It was in 3,500 communities, and these taxes were deliberately designed to thwart it. Eventually, chain store taxes of varying heights were imposed in 29 states. In some cases, these taxes were designed to take away as much as half of A&P's profits per store. They could be really quite sizable. Typically, the tax would be $5 on one store in a state, and $10 on the second store, and $20 on the third through fifth store, and then they mounted up pretty quickly, and they could get into the thousands of dollars per store, depending on the state. So they were really meant to strike a blow against the chains, and in particular against A&P. The political movement against the chains was facilitated by another new technology, radio. if you like today's talk show hosts, you'd have enjoyed W.K. Henderson. Henderson himself was a wealthy and educated merchant and industrialist in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was college educated, he was a multimillionaire, he ran an iron works and many other companies. And because he had an opportunity to buy into somebody's radio station, he bought into radio very early on, liked it, went on the air himself frequently, talking and playing records. In those days, it was, and by the way, he would bump up the power on his station just whenever he felt like doing it, because the regulation of radio stations wasn't very good in those days. And so his radio station could be heard over much of the country. In those days, before radio networks, there was always a problem facing the folks who ran radio stations. What do you put on the air? So one evening, he brought in a speaker, a guy who actually ran a local financial institution in Shreveport, who delivered a speech about the evils of chain stores. What concerned this financial executive was that some of his borrowers were the managers of mom-and-pop stores. They owned mom-and-pop stores, and they were having trouble paying their mortgage because there was too much competition from the chains. So he spoke about the evils of chains. And W.K. Henderson was astonished by the response he got. The telegrams and the letters poured in to his studio on his plantation north of Shreveport. W.K. Henderson, being an entrepreneur, decided there was a business here. So pretty soon, every night, he was doing tirades against the chain stores on the air all over the South. Any merchants that would come through Shreveport, he'd put them on the air. He'd put their wives on the air. He founded a group, the Merchants' Minutemen. For $12 a year, which was a lot of money in 1929, 1930, you could join the Merchants' Minutemen and support the crusade against chain stores. So Henderson had a good business here, and pretty soon he had imitators. In fact, there were half a dozen talk show hosts around the country, radio people, who started anti-chain campaigns. They would talk on the radio about the evils of chain stores. Then they would sell their services as consultants to local merchants who wanted to keep chains out of their communities. Then they would sell their books and their lectures over the air. There was money to be had here. In fact, there was so much money to be had here that the National Grocers Association, which purported to represent the independent merchants, warned its members against supporting these radio guys because most of the money ended up in their pockets rather than doing anything about the chain stores. But this really did strengthen the anti-chain store movement as a national crusade. And by the end of the 1920s, the Federal Trade Commission, actually starting under Calvin Coolidge and then again under Hoover, was investigating chains. There was volume after volume of chain store investigations. There were these chain store taxes in many localities. There were laws passed in many states that began to regulate the prices at which stores could sell merchandise to require a certain markup. And then came Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, of course, in the New Deal, created the National Industrial Recovery Act, and under it the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. You probably know the initials. The NRA was meant to create an informal system of regulating business by creating codes. In each industry, the companies were meant to get together and draft a code of conduct. And this code would be approved by the U.S. government, and then it would have the force of law. The purpose of these codes was frankly to limit competition, because the New Deal's diagnosis of the economic situation was that there was too much competition in the economy and it was driving down prices. So the codes started to come into being, including the retail code, the food retail code. And the food retail code was an absolute nightmare for A&P. The code not only dealt with things like the working hours of grocery store employees, the opening hours of grocery stores, the pay of grocery store workers. It also attacked what were very traditional business practices in the grocery industry. For example, the grocery store code, the food code, required a 6% minimum markup on every individual item sold in a grocery store. Now, think about it for a minute. You go into grocery stores probably all the time and come across specials, 2-for-1 sales, grand opening sales. All of that was illegal. Okay? Each individual item had to be marked up by a minimum amount, and it made no difference what the store's actual operating costs were. If the store could sell a product profitably for less than a 6% markup, it made no difference to the NRA. The product still had to be marked up. All of this was designed to give the mom and pop stores an even footing with the chain stores. Volume discounts were prohibited, so everybody faced the same price when buying. And, oh, by the way, mom and pop stores were excluded from the code. So the code applied only to the chain grocery stores. It did not apply to rural stores. It did not apply to stores where the main employees were family members, which was the bulk of the grocery stores in the country. So here the mom and pop stores had finally managed to win a victory and constrain the A&P. Now, you may wonder why this was such a big deal. And the answer is that food retailing at this point in time was an industry of enormous importance in terms of employment. There were almost 600,000 grocery stores in the United States, grocery stores and other types of food stores. That's one grocery store for every 51 U.S. families. There was a grocery store literally on every corner in big cities. This was an industry that was easy to enter. If you were a worker and you'd lost your job in a factory, you'd been hurt on the railroad, you couldn't do whatever you'd been doing, all it took was a couple $100 and you could open a grocery store. If you didn't know how, you could spend $1 and buy a how-to book. They were readily available, a guide to grocers. And it would tell you how to order merchandise, how to stack the merchandise on your shelves, how to keep a ledger, how to do your shop window. Everything you needed to know was in a book. So this was a safety valve. This was a safety valve for hundreds of thousands of people who had lost their place in the economy and hoped to get back into it by being shopkeepers. Serving these 600,000 or so food stores, there were almost 14,000 food wholesalers, or roughly one wholesaler for every 43 food retailers. And these were pretty small enterprises too, mostly in small towns. So for a small town, if you had a wholesaler that had 15 or 20 employees, this was a very big deal. These were real jobs. This was an important industry in your town. The owner of the wholesaler was probably an important civic leader. A lot of people had stakes in maintaining this system. But this system was maintained at the expense of the U.S. consumer. Around 1929, 1930, the average urban household spent about a third of its income on food. A third of its income. That's more than it spent on rent or on its mortgage. So effectively, U.S. consumers were forced to pay very high prices for food to support all of these wholesalers and retailers and their families all through the distribution system. This is what A&P threatened, and this is why there was such a virulent reaction to A&P. And it put somebody like Roosevelt in a bit of a box. On the one hand, he was portraying himself as the first pro-consumer president, and in a way he was. On the other hand, policies such as the National Recovery Administration were clearly anti-consumer because they had the clear effect of raising prices. Well, the Supreme Court threw out the NRA in 1935, and it looked like mom and pop had been beaten at last, but that turned out not to be true at all. Next up was a then young congressman named Wright Patman. Patman was a congressman from East Texas, from a very, very poor part of the country. And he was someone who had grown up poor and had a great deal of concern about economic concentration. He didn't like big business. Some of you may even recall that Patman, into the 1970s, was chair of the House Banking Committee. So he had a very, very long career in Congress. But he thought that things had been better in the days before chain stores. Moreover, he thought that chain stores were taking away opportunity for the average man. Okay, and we're talking about men here. Before chain stores came along, the average man could go into business for himself and try to get rich, try to build a future. It was opportunity, and the chain stores had taken away that opportunity. So Patman introduced legislation that tried to crack down on volume discounts, on advertising rebates, on other techniques that were very standard in the distribution industry. Under what became the Robinson-Patman Act, passed in 1936, the antitrust law was amended so that a manufacturer could not offer a volume discount to a large customer unless it could specifically prove that somehow its production costs were lower. Okay, the intention here was to equalize the price between A&P and mom and pop. You had mom and pop merchants coming to Congress and saying, if I could buy at the same price as A&P, I could compete with A&P. Well, the small merchant, again, was buying a case at a time, and A&P was buying a train at a time. There was a real difference in the cost of serving these two customers. But the small merchants here won the day, and A&P was very much inhibited in its ability to get volume discounts. It could no longer request advertising rebates from the suppliers, and its prices were forced up. The people in the academic industry, the economists, have done a lot of studies showing why the Robinson-Patman Act had no effect. And it's clearly not true, because this law very much saved the small merchants and very much hindered A&P. You could see this in the stock prices of chain grocery stores, which absolutely tanked in the late 1930s, even as stock prices were doing pretty well. The chain stores had lost their comparative advantage. And Patman wasn't done yet. He came back in 1938, and he proposed to put a national tax on chain stores. Again, this tax would start low for someone who had 3 or 4 stores. It would rise with the number of stores. It would rise to pretty high levels with a lot of stores. And by the way, the tax would be multiplied by the number of states in which the company had a store. In the case of A&P, the Patman tax would take away half its annual sales. Well, A&P responded to this in an entirely novel way. Throughout all of the anti-chain crusades in the 1920s and the 1930s, John Hartford and George Hartford had said nothing. These were people who wanted nothing to do with government. They didn't want to be in the government's business, and they didn't want the government in theirs. They were sure that Americans would see the virtues of their business selling groceries for lower cost. They didn't fight back. But in 1938, they realized that the Patman tax bill was really life-threatening to A&P. If it passed, it would put them out of business. So they took the radical step for them of hiring a PR agent. They hired a guy named Carl Bywar, who was one of a number of people who had been involved in the creation of modern public relations during the First World War. And Bywar laid out a PR campaign for A&P for the first time. It started out with making friends. Okay, A&P had not joined trade associations. A&P had not been involved with interest groups of any sort. The Hartfords didn't believe in it, but Bywar said this isn't going to work anymore. So he started making friends with landlord groups who realized that A&P was a better tenant than many companies because it actually paid its rent on time. Okay? With farmer groups, because A&P's ability to buy in great quantity could be a real boon to farmers. And with labor groups. The Hartfords were very, very paternalistic employers, and they had always sought to avoid dealing with unions. It was not that they hated unions so much as that they thought that they knew how to run their company and that it was their company and they just didn't want anybody else telling them how to run their company. They actually paid very well, but very few of their employees were represented by unions. But suddenly, in 1938, A&P signed an agreement with the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union that it would recognize the union in its stores. And it signed an agreement with the Retail Clerks Union that it would recognize the union in many of its stores. It agreed that it would have its printing done in union print shops and that it would have its groceries delivered by Teamster drivers. Suddenly, the labor movement, which had been very much in favor of restraints on chain stores, changed its tune, changed its direction 180 degrees. Now the labor movement started talking about how all these mom and pop stores that didn't make any profits and sold unsanitary products were driving modern, profitable companies out of business. So Bywar used this type of methodology to bring in friends, to bring in support for A&P and the anti-chain crusade. And it worked. There was now public discussion of the virtues of chain stores. Resolved, chain stores are bad for America, became a debating topic in high schools around the country. Okay? You could see an advertisement in your local newspaper. A&P would buy advertisements in 2,000 newspapers at a time. And by the way, the newspapers also had editorial pages, so they really appreciated the advertisements and let that appreciation be known. This was the first time the company had really ever stepped into public relations, and it had a massive effect. The public was made aware of the virtue of chain stores, and the Patman tax bill never got through the House of Representatives. Nonetheless, mom and pop had survived very well during the 1930s. There were more mom and pop food stores at the end of the decade than there were at the beginning because of all of these actions to limit A&P. And the government wasn't done yet. In 1942, the U.S. Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against A&P, the Hartfords, Carl Bywar, and a bunch of A&P executives. A criminal suit alleging that they had engaged in a criminal conspiracy to restrain trade. There was a trial in Danville, Illinois, at which A&P was found guilty. They were found guilty of criminal restraint of trade for charging low prices. Okay. In the government's opinion, and an opinion that was confirmed by the court, restraint of trade was restraint of trade. And if A&P was handling suppliers roughly for the purpose of driving down prices, that was just as bad as if it had handled suppliers roughly for the purpose of driving up prices. Okay. So A&P was now criminally convicted of selling groceries too cheaply. The Hartfords were convinced that this would be overturned on appeal. And it was not. The U.S. Court of Appeals, in fact, upheld this judgment. Again, taking the reasoning that if A&P was just allowed to discount, then this would eventually drive all the other grocery stores out of business, and then A&P would have a monopoly, and then A&P could charge whatever prices it wanted to charge. During this period, A&P had about 9 or 10% of food sales nationally. So it was hardly a dominant grocer, but its size put terror into retailers and wholesalers everywhere. And this was the response. As soon as it had won this criminal conviction on appeal in 1949, the government returned with a civil antitrust suit asking a court to break up A&P, again for charging too little for its groceries. The Justice Department asked the court to require A&P to sell off all of its manufacturing plants. It was unfair for it to be manufacturing as well as selling groceries. This was an unfair advantage. It asked the court to order A&P out of the produce business. It asked the court to order A&P to stop owning a coffee company. A&P was the largest coffee company in the world. And it asked the court to break A&P up into 7 retail companies because it judged that this company was just too big, too much of a threat to mom and pop. The only thing that brought this to an end, finally, was the inauguration of Dwight Eisenhower in 1953. In the Truman administration, there hadn't been much enthusiasm for chain stores, perhaps because Harry Truman himself was a small-town merchant. You all recall it. He was a haberdasher, right? Dwight Eisenhower was not, and he thought all of this was unnecessary. So in 1953, the government finally dropped its actions against A&P. For the first time in more than a quarter century, the company was not under federal investigation for keeping its prices too low. Well, the food retail business had changed enormously during this period. The economy stores of the World War I era had become what they called combination stores in the 1920s. These are stores that sold meat as well as canned goods and boxed goods. This was a radical idea back then. Things like produce and milk, fresh milk, were introduced as refrigeration became available. And the stores had started to get bigger. The economy stores were perhaps 20 by 30 feet, little tiny stores. The combination stores in the 1920s got to be a little bit bigger than that. In the 1930s, you had the first small supermarkets. Small by today's standards, huge by the standards of the time. A&P was slow to get into the supermarket business, but when it did in the late 1930s, it did so with a vengeance, and it was the biggest supermarket operator in the country by the start of the Second World War. In fact, it had more supermarkets than all of the other grocery store companies combined. It was an innovator. It took ideas from others and figured out how to adapt them to the food retail industry and do so profitably. But a lot of that was due to the genius of John Hartford. In 1951, John Hartford died. 2 years later, even though the government abandoned its antitrust suit, A&P started to founder. The company, now free of federal oversight, had the ability to do anything it wanted now. It didn't have to explain itself to any investigators. But the people who were running it after John Hartford's death were people who'd been in the company their entire careers. They were literally people who'd started selling groceries from horse carts back at the turn of the century. George Hartford was still alive, but he was now in his 90s. He was not taking a very active role. And so the people running it were very, very conservative men. John Hartford had been willing to embrace change with the economy store and the combination store and the supermarket and vertical integration. The people running A&P after his death were afraid to change. They thought A&P ought to continue to do what it had been doing all along. At a time when the country was changing greatly, there was the great move to the suburbs in the wake of World War II. Well, A&P stores were in the central city. It didn't have many stores in the suburbs. It didn't really want to build many stores in the suburbs. It didn't know about building bigger stores with parking lots. That's something it had never done before. A&P, although it was coast to coast, had most of its stores east of the Mississippi by a very wide margin. It had a handful of stores in California. There was talk in the 1950s, should we invest more in California? Should we expand here? And the decision was no. It's too far away. we don't really know anything about California. Well, California was the fastest growing state in the United States in every decade between 1950 and 2000. And A&P was not there. You had the development of new retail formats, and A&P was still torn up internally by things like, should we sell toothpaste? It had sold food. It saw itself as a grocer. It hadn't really tried to move into other areas, but now you had the creation of new discount stores and other kinds of stores that sold other things, plus perhaps food. And A&P had to change to compete, and it couldn't do so. It was not willing to continue the process of reinventing itself that the Hartfords had done so well. So by the end of the 1950s, the company was absolutely in a tailspin. What the U.S. government and the state governments and the merchants' Minutemen had failed to do in a quarter century of trying, market forces did to A&P in very short order. It was the largest retailer in the world as late as 1963. It was losing market share year by year. It was losing profitability. Eventually, it was sold off. The Hartfords, after the Hartfords' deaths, the company was taken public, and it proved to be a disastrous investment, and it was sold to a German company in 1979. The big losers in this were the people who depended on something called the John A. Hartford Foundation. This was the recipient of the ownership shares in A&P, 2/5 of the company, controlled directly by George and John Hartford. They'd left these shares to the company at the foundation at their deaths. It was one of the biggest foundations in America, and it was supporting medical research, this at a time when very few people had much interest in medical research. But the John A. Hartford Foundation had kept most of its assets in A&P stock because the president of the John A. Hartford Foundation was also the president of A&P. So when A&P stock tanked, the Hartford Foundation tanked, and medical researchers all over the country found their grants cut off. This was a sad story, and A&P quickly declined to nothingness. The company is still around today. It's operating under Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It probably does not have a future in the retail grocery trade. As for mom and pop, they're not around today. But they were around a lot longer than they could reasonably have been expected to be. Chain retailing became a major economic force in the 1920s. Mom and pop were strong into the 1950s. As late as the late 1940s, the U.S. government was using veterans' benefits under the GI Bill to help returning veterans open grocery stores. They could be mom and pop grocers too. Government policy here protected the profitability of hundreds of thousands of mom and pop grocers by slowing the pace of economic change. So it really did bail out Main Street. It really did bail out mom and pop to the detriment not only of these larger companies, but to the detriment of American consumers. It was only in the 1950s that Americans were really able to discover the joys of discount retailing, an opportunity that might have been available to them 30 years ago had the government not decided to bail out Main Street. Thank you. Yeah.
How were the NRA retail food code, how would it work if one considers employee hours and store hours that were decided by the code vis-a-vis the blue laws in a state like Pennsylvania? Can you look into that?
No, the blue laws, I believe, generally pertain to Sundays. Is that not correct?
Some.
Yeah. The NRA codes put maximum weekly operating hours on food stores.
Not what day.
Not what day, no. But they had to close because part of their supposed advantage was, mom and pop got tired and they needed some time off. and the chain store never got tired. So you needed to equalize things between mom and pop and the chain.
I just asked because I remember when the chain stores started to pay the fees in Pennsylvania, they ignored the blue laws, and that's the way they got around it, because they could pay the fee and still stay open. But that didn't affect A&P.
No, and what happened here with, the government created literally an army of inspectors, many of them unpaid, just members of local citizens committees, that would look for violations of the NRA codes. And a big company was very vulnerable here. Okay, people were naturally going to go into the chain store and take a look for violations. The mom and pop stores, the mom and pop wholesalers, they were not subject to this. When there were actually academic studies of the violations of the NRA wholesaling code, for example, they found that large wholesalers uniformly complied with the code. Small wholesalers generally ignored the code. And if somebody called it to their attention, they'd say, oh, we didn't know, we didn't understand. So this was very much structured against the big companies and in favor of the small ones. And I'd point out that that is somewhat the inverse of what is often said about the NRA. Okay? There have been any number of books written that portray the NRA actually as a way for big companies to squeeze little ones. In the food area, at least, it was actually quite the opposite. It was the small companies that were the winners and the big companies that were the losers. Yeah, you had a question?
There seems to have been a discussion about helping the mom and pops in other areas as well. I've done research and for helping patrons in with regards to drugstores and I think department stores as well. The fear of the big, can answer all questions store versus the mom and pops. So it seems to have been a larger issue than just the drugstore or the grocery store.
That's true. There was other legislation, for example, that I didn't talk about, which had a greater effect on department stores. There were restrictions that favored drugstores. There were a number of states, for example, that required that a drugstore had to be owned by a pharmacist. So basically outlawing chain drugstores. The most serious attacks, though, were in the grocery area. And they were on A&P in part because of its size and visibility, and in part because these types of taxes that the Supreme Court permitted were taxes that really whacked A&P. Department store chains typically had a very small number of units, so actually they were not very much affected by these taxes, whereas a company such as A&P with thousands and thousands of stores was really very vulnerable to attack on this front. Yeah.
Speaking of restraint, your whole book invites comparisons to Walmart. You avoid any such comparisons here, and that could be the topic of a whole other discussion. But just briefly, there's some objective comparisons. You said 30% of people's incomes were spent on food at one point. How has that changed? A&P had X thousand stores. How does that compare to Walmart?
The average today is somewhere around 7% of people's incomes are spent on food in the United States. Okay, so it is just an enormous, enormous decline. And that's not all due to changes in the distribution system, but a lot of it is due to changes in the distribution system. So A&P's ideas here made an enormous difference. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book, and there were a number, but there is a lot of literature on Walmart, and it tends to be very ahistorical. There are books, for example, that talk in detail about how Walmart squeezes suppliers. Everything that Walmart does to its suppliers, A&P did in the 1920s. Okay, there's really not much new under the sun here. The Walmart doesn't manufacture, which A&P did, but most of its techniques for reducing costs are techniques that were pioneered by the Hartfords. The Hartfords, moreover, really introduced into retailing the idea that you can make a lower profit on each item and make it up on volume. This was really a change in mindset. The traditional way of looking at the retail sector, the way that most storekeepers looked at it, was that you wanted to look at your profit per item. So you were going to sell this can and you wanted to make such a percent profit on this. The Hartfords understood that that didn't make any sense. Okay, what you were interested in was not your profit per item, it was your return on investment. And if you were willing to take a lower profit per item, you might have a lot more people coming through the doors, your sales would be much higher, and you'd make a much better return on investment. That was, in its day, a revolutionary approach to the retail business. It's an approach that Walmart uses heavily now. I don't think that Walmart cares at all about the profit per item. That's not the way they look at the world. They care very greatly about the return on every investment dollar, just as the Hartford brothers did. Yeah.
Do you know what the average profit margin is for grocery stores now? You talked about the 6% markup.
Well,
That point,
the markup is not the same as a profit margin. Okay, and it's hard to calculate in part because it's not clear how you would define the industry now. The boundaries have changed. The largest grocer in the country, recall, is not a grocer, right? And it provides information about its profits, but you have no way of disentangling the profitability of its food business from any other business. So it's really quite hard to know now. But the Hartford's, when they started a more scientific approach to food retailing, it was typical that the cost of operating the store would be 20% or more of the cost of sales. And they brought it down to below 10% in their stores, on average. And even lower in big stores. They discovered there are economies of scale in retailing, and if you have a bigger store, you can make a lot more money than if you have smaller stores. So they had very sharp pencils. George Hartford was a very data-driven guy. And you have to remember, this was in the 1920s. There were no computers. All the data that they used had to be collected by hand and collated and added up on adding machines. But when he and his executives would sit down to a meeting, they would get a data pack like that. And it was filled with everything you could imagine. The average cost of electricity per store in the Albany district versus the Columbus, Ohio district. Or the average expenditure on advertising circulators here versus there, circulars. Comparative metrics so that they could look at each of the divisions, and within the divisions they could look at each of the units, and they could see who stands out, who's higher than normal and why, or who's lower than normal and why. So they were really very, very data intensive at a time when that was not at all the norm in the retail sector. George Hartford into the 1920s actually was keeping an eye, if you can believe it, on the profitability of each individual store. And he finally had to admit that with 16,000 stores, he really couldn't do that anymore.
You started to answer the question I had when you mentioned the economy store in Jersey City and the cost of inventory. Were they the innovators in cost analysis?
Yes.
Or was that company?
I guess I should use the word innovators advisedly, in the sense that the Hartfords were in no sense inventors. Okay? They were not really the first to do anything. Okay? What their skill was, what their absolute skill was, is taking ideas that were around and applying them to their business. Okay? At the time of the economy store, there was a lot of talk about scientific management. How do we have a better idea of what's going on in our business, and how do we measure it? And they didn't invent scientific management. They said, how do we take these ideas and apply them to food retailing? And that's what they did in Jersey City. And that's what they did in many, many areas of their business. Yes?
One distinction, I believe, between the mom and pop stores and the A&P and whatever other chain competitors they had that was probably quite significant, especially in the 1930s, was that the mom and pop stores would often extend credits to their customers, and A&P was, as you used the term, cash in theory. And in those days, until workers found a job or got paid for intermittent work or things of that sort, that was a pretty significant advantage, if you will, to mom and pop. It may have resulted in a lot of write-offs and losses, but I'm wondering to what extent that really had an impact both on the larger political discussion and perhaps in keeping at least the mom and pop concept, if not individual mom and pop merchants, around for longer than might have been the case otherwise.
No, you're absolutely correct. A&P flatly refused to do business with credit. The reason that the mom and pop stores were so popular is precisely because they offered credit. People's memories do get a bit misty, and I find it fascinating how many recollections there are of the grocer who was down at the corner all during someone's childhood. The average mom and pop grocery store was in business between 3 and 4 years. And what put it out of business was credit, okay, because it had extended credit to these people who either couldn't pay and when they were asked to pay, shopped somewhere else, never came in again, or people who fled town. The credit losses were enormous, and the merchants really had no way to manage them. So at some point, they simply went out of business. That was true of wholesalers as well. I tell in the book the story of a produce wholesaler that operated a business supplying grocery stores in a Texas oil patch town. They would extend 1 week's credit to the grocery stores. So they would deliver this week's produce and get paid for last week's produce. Well, the boom turned to bust. All the grocery stores closed up overnight. The wholesaler didn't get paid for that last week's delivery, and the wholesaler had to close down. So this was a common problem with these mom and pop merchants. It's absolutely why they stayed in business so long collectively, as you say, but it's also why individually there were very, very few mom and pop grocery stores that reached their 10th birthday.
We are running out of time here.
Great.
The book is available for sale outside the door. So thank you for coming. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.